All right, we are back. Welcome back to Vikings Vantage, presented by Pepsi. Gabe Henderson here alongside Chris Corso and our guest of the night, ESPN's Courtney Cronin. Courtney, how's it going?
It's going. We're at week 15. We keep chugging along with this crazy NFL season.
Chugging, that is very true. I don't think you can say it any better than that. And I think just for starters, I mean, we haven't talked to you all year. So what's been your take on this Vikings team to week 15 at this point thus far?
I think you take the temperature of the team in 2 different points, actually probably more than that, multiple different points. Obviously the 1-5 start, and you're wondering, are they going to tear this thing apart and start thinking about the future, trade off expensive assets, try to get a little bit of cap relief in there, start building towards a year where they're supposed to be really competitive, because they were so young on defense and they had a lot of injuries and a lot of things that didn't go their way. But when they beat Green Bay and they don't make any moves at the trade deadline, that to me signified, okay, this team thinks that it can win still with the group that it has this year. Now, how much they can win, if that means a playoff berth, how far they could get in the playoffs, I think at that point was all relative. But you know, they made a really impressive mark from weeks 8 through 10 with the 3 division opponents that they had and going 3-0 against them. And then they stumble against Dallas and they start kind of going back into the slide of playing not so great football, but at least enough good football in bad games to come away with wins against Carolina and then in Jacksonville. And then obviously last week with Tampa Bay, you know, the kicking issues have kind of reared their head. I mean, it feels like it's been a topic we've talked about for years here in Minnesota, but not to this degree before. And that leads like a level of intrigue for this weekend about whether Dan Bailey's going to be the kicker or not, because these next 3 games, like Kirk Cousins said, you have to be playing your best football right now. Otherwise, you're going to be sitting home that second week in January when the wild card round starts. And I don't think this team put all that in, run Dalvin Cook truly, into the ground in order for them to be on the outside looking in at the end of week 17. And they don't have a playoff spot. Like, they went all in because they felt like they could at least get the 7th seed in the playoffs. Mm-hmm. So anything outside of that, I think, would be a really big disappointment.
Looking forward, I really want to ask what you think the formula for success is for this Vikings offense, because in my opinion, they did just about everything right with the hard parts of the game last week. They go against the number 1 rushing defense in the NFL and they run down their throats. But then in the big moments, at the end of drives, in the red zone, it didn't seem to all come together. So in these next 3 games, they clearly need to almost win out to make it into the playoffs. So what's the formula for success, in your opinion, for the Vikings offense going forward?
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point. I mean, the way that they got the run game going was the typical Gary Kubiak system, where it's outside zone, forcing things to the edge, trying to get Dalvin in space and make plays in space. And so you can do that against Chicago too, because 2 very comparable run defenses. Obviously, you have Akeem Hicks there in the middle of that Bears defense, kind of like you had in Ndamukong Suh. And I think you can limit the damage that they do by doing that. Now, if your blocking takes a hit because you might not have Kyle Rudolph, you might not have CJ Ham, then that's obviously a big problem. But in my opinion, I need to see Justin Jefferson getting involved in this game a lot earlier than he has been. They've been putting top corners on the top receiver, and A, that's a testament to Jefferson, but B, that's something he's got to work through. And it's also something that Kirk's got to work through too, that tight ends took on a humongous passing role with Rudolph out and Irv Smith and Tyler Conklin going for over 100 yards receiving. That's very important, but you can't tell me that just because there might be bracket coverage or somebody's doubling Thielen or what have you, that you can't find ways to scheme those guys to get involved. It doesn't always have to be a deep shot off play action. It can be the intermediate passing game. It can be a lot of different things. So the way that I look at that is, it's inexcusable to not get Justin Jefferson double-digit targets every single game from here on out, because look at what's happened the times that you've done it. Outside of one game, which I'm fairly certain was the Atlanta game, they won all those games. And he is like, I know this is a run-first offense, and I know that this is a scheme that they want to go through Dalvin Cook first, but you have, potentially the offensive rookie in the year who's playing out of his mind right now, and he's walking away with, half a dozen catches, if that, half a dozen targets. Like, that's not acceptable. That's something that you have to change within the scheme to make sure that even when the run is working and even when it's not, Jefferson has to be the part that gets you going, if that makes sense.
So I feel like you're like on the train now of like, all right, Dalvin Cook's not going to be the rushing leader anymore. So is that, do you see that being more likely now with Dalvin Cook? Hey, let's get the rushing leader numbers out the way and let's focus on more being creative with this offense.
Yeah, I don't think, I mean, he's at like 1350 something right now. Like, I know that a rushing title would obviously mean a lot to him, but unless there's contract incentives that Dalvin's chasing, which, you know, by all means, if that's the case, go for it. But like, you also have to think about, and I just wrote a story about this on ESPN.com, like, what are these final 3 games going to tell us? If you run Dalvin into the ground these final 3 games and you don't make the playoffs, what are you setting him up for in 2021 when you have the chance again to be competitive? It's a smart usage thing because he is your offense and he can handle a lot for sure. But chasing a rushing title, chasing 2,000 yards, anything arbitrary like that, I just don't think matters at this point. And I don't really think it matters to him too. I mean, like, he was asked about it, and of course he would want that. That's a great honor to have. But, you know, he's leading the game. He's leading the league in scrimmages, touches from scrimmage per game. He's second in scrimmage yards. Like, he's doing just fine on his own. Like, I don't think he has to prove anything to anybody. I think the Vikings need to be cognizant, as the way that they were in Tampa Bay, like using some other running backs, a fullback, to be able to spell him a little bit more than we had seen early on. Do that. So if indeed you do get to the playoffs, he is fresh, because like, what did we see a few years ago with Todd Gurley when they went to the Super Bowl? He was the workhorse back all season long throughout the playoffs. And then boom, NFC championship game, something happens.
Nowhere to be found.
And then the Super Bowl, he's got 10 carries and a catch that went for negative yardage. Like, you need to be available in the most important games. And I think that there are ways for the Vikings, clearly, like we saw in week 10, to beat Chicago without Dalvin Cook having to rush for 100 yards. And I think a lot of that runs through the piece that you have that you use your top draft pick on.
Speaking of important games, we have one on the docket where Gabe is right now. That's actually not a screensaver behind Gabe. He's at US Bank Stadium.
I was like, Courtney Cronin's here, so I'm going to the stadium.
And Courtney Cronin is here, and we bring her on, obviously, because she does great work for ESPN, but I believe you're an Illinois native. Is that correct?
I am. Glenview, just north of the city.
Did you grow up a Chicago Bears fan?
I get that question all the time. Like, they were terrible in the 90s. Like, when like my formative years of like forming, like, you know, do I like football? Would I rather be an NBA fan? Like, obviously in the 90s, it was great to be an NBA fan in Chicago. But like, the Bears were atrocious. And I get accused of being a Bears homer for some godforsaken reason. It makes no sense, because like, go back and look at those teams from my childhood. Like, Cade McNown was like the quarterback that I grew up with. Like, that's a pretty sad childhood.
What about Rex Grossman? Did you get a little bit of that run?
That was like the early 2010s, like 2009, all that stuff. Later, and I remember the Super Bowl year. I was a sophomore in high school. And I remember going to the NFC Championship game, which actually was an interdivision game between the Bears and the Packers. And I think that's where the smoking Jay Cutler meme came from. And so like, I never claimed to be a Bears fan. I don't know. We were more of a college football family to begin with. But the Bears like didn't make it easy on anybody. I mean, all these years later, they still haven't figured out their quarterback problem. So I understand why they don't make it easy on people. But I definitely couldn't claim to be a Bears fan. I guess more fair weather, if anything. I mean, we went to a couple games here and there, but mostly we were going to Bulls games when I was growing up, like that, and obviously Cubs games for sure.
I figured you would say you were a Denver Broncos fan. We heard the other day that you would slide into your couch.
Yeah, that was just because I was being an idiot, and like that was, it was the fun thing to do. It's nice to know that Kirk and I have something in common there. So we both screwed up couch cushions.
Speaking of Kirk, though, I mean, you talk about sliding. Kirk says he's been doing a lot more sliding. That's been a part of, avoiding sacks. I mean, that was a big topic yesterday in the actual media presser. And Kirk was like, avoiding sacks is huge for quarterbacks. It's not just the lineman stat. So, with this offense throwing the ball more, do you think the Vikings are built to do that? With Kirk showing that he's able to run more, be able to, drop back and not have to worry about Dalvin touching the ball and, put more of the offense, put more of the pressure on Kirk to be able to provide with his legs and arm?
Yeah, I know he said that there's a lot of meat left on the bone, which I think is an encouraging sign. I don't think that you want that to be something that's so consistent that it becomes predictable. When used in bits and pieces, I remember a couple years ago, they had a goal for Kirk his first season, get a rushing first down with your feet every game. And I'm sure that that's increased because obviously he got 41 yards scrambling last week. And even with the quarterback draw, I mean, that was good. I will say that it gives if you're not expecting it, like, because Matt Ryan doesn't run, right? And a lot of people compare Matt Ryan to Kirk and, he gets the statue notations. Kirk doesn't get that specifically, but nobody's going to say, wow, Kirk is all of a sudden becoming Michael Vick, which was kind of like the running joke this summer. He's, he said, he's like, I'm not Michael Vick. And I'm like, yes, Kirk, you don't wear number 7 and throw left-handed. I think it adds a nice element to this offense, and it makes it's something he's really happy about, like that they're giving him the freedom to do that, because ball security isn't an issue with him when he's running with it. I mean, obviously strip sacks, fumbles there, that's a different story, but like he's very good at protecting his body as evidence when he's diving head first and, the guy doesn't get hurt, knock on wood. But also like coming up with the ball and helping extend, move the chains and all of that. Like he's been a really important part of the offense that way. So I think they're going to continue to take those opportunities when they present themselves, and he's shown that he can do it. That's until he shows that he can't, like, why not let him keep running with it?
I really think this offense goes as Kirk Cousins goes in the pass protection standpoint. So when he sacked 6 times last week, that was a huge problem for the Vikings going against one of the best blitzing teams in the NFL in the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I see the Chicago team, and I see what Khalil Mack did last week. I mean, I think he had a safety in the end zone on Deshaun Watson. So what do the Vikings need to do, Courtney, in this game to really combat that rushing attack of the Chicago Bears?
Being able to help with, maybe change some of the protections on the interior so you can mitigate some of those weaknesses would be probably beneficial. I don't exactly know how you do it. At this point, you're going to try to run the ball. Like they clearly are. That's how they want to establish the game. But like once that stops, because Dalvin had 30 plus touches again that last time in Chicago. And it's like the guy's getting like, under 3 yards per carry because this run defense is so tough. And then Akeem Hicks goes out of the game and it kind of changes the complexion of it. Mm-hmm. So I think it's trying to wear them down that way, but also, using more play action. So he's not just standing back there in the pocket, trying to change his Kirk and change his launch points and where he's throwing the football from to try to slide him away from wherever the protection is, wherever the rush is coming from is probably going to be the best.
Maybe like not the play action every single time.
Yeah, no, definitely. You don't want to make it like predictable. That's for sure.
For sure.
Yeah. And with, a lot of these teams blitzing us, I think the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, their recipe for success was blitzing and stacking the box.
Mm-hmm.
You can't really do play action passing. You're forcing Kirk to be decisive. You're double teaming the outside. So that's why you see a lot of guys like Tyler Conklin and those guys get catches. But, this Bears defense, we know they had 7 sacks last week. In their 6-game losing streak, they only had 8. We've given up 14 sacks the past week. So I think that's going to be an area of concern. But I want to get your thoughts on the third quarter. This is, the Bears have the worst third quarter offense. We have the worst third quarter defense. Do you think winning the third quarter will be one of the major keys to success for the Vikings this upcoming Sunday?
Yeah, but I think they should be doing it before then, because the last few weeks you've seen this team go into halftime trailing or in a really not so good spot. And then it kind of unravels. And then you have the fourth quarter where Kirk can certainly mount a comeback. They showed that they can hang with Tampa Bay, a really good team, like by what they did there in the third quarter. But, this doesn't need to be a second half team, but they've kind of gotten in that rhythm lately. But look, like it just shows you they don't have to be, because look at how good they were on that first drive. And yes, the missed extra point lets them air out of this team. It was kind of like, okay, here we go again. And then it really was, here we go again, because the protection was not good and it forced them into field goal situations that they couldn't convert on. So I think if they want to be a better first half team, those things have to get fixed. The protection issues, certainly the kicking game, but also like being able to finish drives that not have it lead to field goals that way.
Yeah.
My last question here is, you've been here a few years. I've been here a few years. Gabe is new to the Vikings. I don't think he realizes that every single year we play our last home game at US Bank Stadium against the Chicago Bears. Sometimes it's come down to their playoff hopes, sometimes ours. A few years ago, they took away our playoff hopes. This year, we're both in the same exact situation. So what do you make of all that, Courtney?
I mean, the Bears are going to want to play spoiler. They're right behind the Vikings in the hunt for the playoffs. And, what I think theoretically Minnesota needs to go 2-1 in this stretch, and they need Arizona to go 1-2. And it's like, you don't really control your own destiny, which in my opinion means you have to win every single game from here on out. Like every game is must win. And I think that's the vibe that you get in talking to guys, that there's no room for error. There's no room for mistakes. Like the mistakes that you saw against Jacksonville, like that can't happen anymore, especially on special teams and some of the defensive things that happen. The miscommunication between Kirk and Dalvin and the fumble, inside the 5-yard line, Kirk getting the pick 6, all of that, that can't happen in these games, because the Bears just put up 30 points. And granted, they did it against a really bad Texans team, but the Vikings played that Texans team and didn't put up, that big of a margin in between them and the win. So I look at this as, if they don't beat the Bears this weekend, it's probably over. Because we're going to see how all the stats of percentages and probabilities, how that's going to change. Because the big one, obviously, people are already looking at is New Orleans. And, New Orleans just lost to Philly. And granted, it was a close game and it was a new quarterback and they were on the road. I guess you expect that as a possibility. But the Vikings have to go down to the Superdome, which surprisingly they played well there last year. And they've got to pull away with a victory in order to stay alive. So, in that 2018 game that you're referring to, Chris, like when they were trying to back their way into the playoffs, instead they're 8-7-1. I mean, from the jump, they were awful. And, it looked like they were unraveling on the field and then on the sideline for obvious reasons. And, I think that was very much a wake-up call for this team. Like, we don't want to be in this position again. But, they have the tools in place to beat the Bears. I think they really do. I mean, Mitchell Trubisky, I don't know if we're going to buy in and say that he's all of a sudden having a resurgence and all that, but they still have some good weapons. Allen Robinson is still really good, and their defense is really good. So you beat them, and it was an ugly 19-13 game that first time around. You can probably do it again if you follow a similar formula there, and also get Justin Jefferson involved. I don't know how many times I have to say it. That's got to be priority number one over Dalvin Cook, in my opinion.
Yeah, no special teams touchdowns this week, but Vikings versus Bears, round number 2. This will be coming Sunday, 12 p.m. You can listen to that game right here on KFAN 100.3 with voice of the Vikings, Paul Allen and Pete Bursich calling that game. Courtney, appreciate your time today.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Of course, for Courtney Cronin, Chris Corso, I'm Gabe Henderson. Thank you again for tuning into another episode of Vikings Vantage, presented by Pepsi. Pepsi, that's what I like.